To my fellow white trans people, Palestinians are not our enemy. They don't want to hurt us, they don't sit there fantasizing about torturing us, and they don't dream of executing us. To be frank, they don't give a toss about our existence, they just want to survive the ongoing genocide currently being enacted upon them by the European state of Israel. And whilst I wish that was as much as needed to be said, sadly, as seen in some of the comments posted to this very channel, that is not the case. That's why I need to do a video on this topic, bringing to the forefront stuff we discussed throughout our videos over the years, presenting it in one nice neat package. But first, a quick content warning for the following: Islamism, racism, transmism, homomism, intermism, and genocide. If our work has helped you, please consider supporting us via Patreon so that we can keep the channel running. You can also help us by liking, commenting, and sharing our work on social media. Hi there, my name is Ethel Thurston, she, her, they, them, and we need to talk about the facts that, contrary to popular far-right and centrist narratives, Palestinians, and by extension Muslims and people of Middle Eastern origin, are not our enemy. A fact which has become especially important with recent events these last couple of weeks. Though, to be clear, this is a video I've been working on for a while now as it keeps coming up, often in the worst ways imaginable. Take the following interaction. Someone who has a Palestinian flag in their profile picture posted a supportive comment to one of our videos, ending with the declaration that everyone should just leave trans people alone. Simple enough. Sadly, upon seeing that post, another user by the name of Nicola Johnson, seemingly a white trans person, responded with, quote, "I'm trans, but please leave the Palestinian flag behind, as they would gladly kill people like me, so I don't want to see that flag." End quote. This shows a complete lack of awareness, not to mention basic humanity. For a start, the Palestinian people are victims of an ongoing genocide. Erasure of the Palestinian people and their indigenous status via any means, including attempts to limit or outright censor their flag, helps Israel cover up said atrocity, making one an accomplice in that genocide. There is absolutely nothing any person or group of people could do that would justify genocide. Genocide is, by definition, violence that indiscriminately targets all members of a group, including the countless LGBT+ Palestinians whom bigots such as Nicola Johnson have chosen to erase, condemning said queer Palestinians to a silent extermination. And let this be a warning, I will not be blacking out your name in the same way I do with people who I think are genuinely misinformed if you come to our channel in an attempt to justify genocide. Nicola Johnson chose to make this comment to a public space, somewhere others can see it, and whilst I'd usually black out their name for a variety of reasons, I will not be seen assisting anyone in covering up their genocide, which is exactly what this is. If you want to take part in that, you can do so out in the open where all can see you and take note of your inhumanity. Moving on to the particulars, however, carnal knowledge, meaning sexual acts, against the order of nature were criminalized in Palestine in 1936 via the British Mandate Criminal Code Ordinance No. 74, Section 152, subsection 2, carrying with it a 10-year prison sentence. Note, the bill doesn't discriminate on the basis of gender, merely that they have engaged in what it labels acts against the order of nature, such as anal sex. UK laws of the time rarely distinguish between gay cis men and straight trans women. As far as I'm aware, Palestine never had any laws explicitly targeting just trans people, so I will take this as doing just that. We will assume, for the sake of argument, that this law criminalizes the entire LGBT+ community, including trans people. As is explicit in the name of the mandate, said ordinance was forced upon the Palestinian people by the British government who occupied them at the time. This is a common theme throughout the Middle East, North Africa and South Asia, a fact I am acutely aware of living in India, which officially overturned Section 377 of the British mandated Indian Penal Code in 2018, the year after I moved here. Section 377, put in place by the British Raj in 1860, prohibited so-called unnatural offences, just like the mandate in Palestine. It was actually this knowledge that led me to catch Zionists editing the Wikipedia page on LGBT+ rights in Palestine when their genocide began in full, with them removing any mention of the ordinance being a British mandate. They did this to try and bolster their narrative that all Palestinians, including children, feminists, and LGBT+ Palestinians, are violent monsters who would murder a queer person the moment they saw them. The narrative invoked by Johnson isn't merely similar, it's identical to that exploited by the occupational forces seeking to exterminate the Palestinian people in a blatant attempt to justify the unjustifiable. These things cannot be separated. Yet, returning to the law, the reason the British mandated these ordinances throughout North Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East is because the regions had become known as a place where queerness not only existed, but could thrive out in the open. As a former engineer in the French Navy wrote in a letter of complaint to a travelogue, quote, "The passion contrary to nature constitutes the delight, or, to use a juster term, the infamy of the Egyptians. It is not for the women that their amorous ditties are composed. It is not on them that their tender caresses are lavished. Far different objects inflame them. This horrid deprivation, which, to the disgrace of polished nations, is not altogether unknown to them, is generally diffused over Egypt. The rich and the poor are equally infected with it." End quote. This is why these regions came to be viewed as a sanctuary by the wealthy European queer community during the 19th and 20th century. Many queer icons, including the likes of Andra Gide, Oscar Wilde, Edward M. Forster, and Jean Genet, made pilgrimages to Algeria, Morocco, Egypt, and similar countries as a means of escaping the persecution that existed throughout much of Europe. That's why the British felt the need to put in place mandates to put an end to that safety. And sadly, it worked. As noted by Charles Lindholm regarding northern Pakistan in 1982, quote, "Homoerotic relationships were much more common a generation ago than they are now, since Western influence has brought a sense of shame about homosexuality, at least among the more educated." End quote. To make matters worse, the US, the UK, and other EU nations then destabilized the Middle East, creating power vacuums which allowed extremist factions to seize control, many of whom had adopted Europe's violent queer misia as reactionary minds are particularly vulnerable to appeals to disgust, like those invoked by Europeans to demonize queerness. This is a common theme of colonialism, with violent queer misia being spread by the global north like a plague throughout the Middle East, Asia, Africa, and South America. Much of the violence against the LGBT+ community worldwide falls squarely at the feet of the global north, particularly the UK and subsequently the US, which continue said violence via Catholic and evangelical missionaries, as seen in places such as Uganda. You cannot tackle queer misia on a global scale without first understanding where it came from, how it came to dominate, and how it continues to be upheld. All to say, I'm tired of fellow white queer people using violence against queer people in the Middle East as an excuse to write off the entire region, including the people who are directly suffering, because it's uncomfortable to acknowledge that our nations are largely to blame for instilling and then violently enforcing those very laws. I feel like it's become a way for many white queer people or self-declared allies to wash their hands of our historic violence, to claim moral superiority over the people we victimized. Returning to Palestine, however, I must note that they bucked the trend. For you see, the first group to repeal this particular ordinance was the Muslim-controlled West Bank in 1951, decriminalizing homosexuality. For comparison, Britain didn't decriminalize homosexuality until 1967, and the European occupiers who formed Israel didn't repeal that very same mandate until 1977, a whole 2.5 decades after Palestinians in the West Bank led the way. And yet, just as Israel appropriates Palestinian food, art, and culture, it now steals Palestine's title in claiming that Israel was a leader in gay equality in the Middle East, in spite of the fact that same-gender marriages cannot be legally performed in Israeli-occupied territories. This is pure pinkwashing on Israel's part, PR meant to cover for their apartheid, and subsequent genocide. With Gaza, things are a little more complicated. Said law is still technically in place, yet I've not seen any evidence of said law being upheld. This difference between Gaza and the West Bank is likely due to the disparity in violence faced under the occupation, with Gaza suffering more, relatively speaking, than the West Bank. This is also what has empowered Hamas, which, to be clear, does not control the West Bank, in spite of Israel repeatedly claiming otherwise, as it expanded the scope of its ongoing genocide. As such, I think Gaza's been a bit preoccupied. When you're being denied food, water, and medicine whilst living under the constant threat of raids by both Israeli forces and settlers, symbolically removing laws you aren't currently upholding seems trivial. Now, that doesn't mean Gaza or even the West Bank are queer utopias. Even the perspective of such places being safe back in the 18th to early 20th century was through the very Orientalist lens of relatively wealthy gay men. I don't want to create a rose-tinted narrative that puts Palestine on a pedestal, least of all since doing so makes it easier to push off and demonize further. Palestinians are people, and people have, in general, not had a great history when it comes to the treatment of LGBT+ folk, even when they're not explicitly outlawed. But it bears pointing out that Palestinians are not these monstrous entities, contrary to what the Israeli occupiers and genocideers like to pretend. This is especially true when it comes to trans people, with both Shia and Sunni leaders having issued fatwas accepting us. Does that mean trans people are accepted throughout the Middle East? No. Does that complexity mean they all want us dead? Of course not, and it is incredibly reductionist, not to mention hypocritical, to assert otherwise. After all, Israel has a long history of blackmailing LGBT+ Palestinians to work for them as informants under the threat of outing. This is horrific violence by Israeli occupiers against queer Palestinian people that is often ignored, again, with Israel presenting itself as some sort of champion for queer people in the Middle East. However, some are quick to point out that said terror tactic wouldn't work if there wasn't that fear of violence from the wider Palestinian community as a result of being outed. Except, the same is true in the global north. Outing someone is a horrifically violent act that can result in prison sentencing, particularly in cases of intimate partner violence, because of the dangers involved. So, why is it that said issue condemns all Palestinians, including LGBT+ Palestinians, to genocide, but not ourselves. It's a double standard. White European nations are given time to socially improve in ways that nations still living under colonial violence are not. And that's before we even get to the fact that the UK government is knowingly murdering trans children en masse. UK police have been caught denying individual trans children their heart medications without input from a medical professional, i.e. attempted murder, and have also gone on record stating their desire to increase the violence inflicted upon trans people by forcing trans women to be searched by cis male officers. I mean, the Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention and Human Security has just issued a red flag warning on the UK in an attempt to protect all trans and intersex people on the 1st of July. In doing so, they've joined Human Rights Watch, the United Nations, and over 750 historians in condemning the government's slow enactment of genocide against both trans and intersex people. A genocide orchestrated by the British government, enabled by the general public. And don't even get me started on all the shit that's being done to the US trans community by evangelicals following through on Project 2025. This selective focus is 100% racist. I hate to break it to you, but the global north is not some shining utopia for queer people. It never was. The most privileged amongst us just got comfortable with feeling like things were headed in the right direction, whilst everyone else suffered. So no, your queerness, more specifically transness, doesn't magically absolve you of your racism, especially when what you are doing fundamentally hurts LGBT+ Palestinians as you mark them for genocide. Just needed to make that absolutely clear. I will not tolerate this shit on our channel. And before people comment telling me that I have no idea what I'm talking about since I'm a white British person living in India and haven't spent much time around Muslims from a Muslim majority country, let me be clear that I now live inside an Afghan community in Delhi, having moved there after living on the border of one for 3 years. Yet, in spite of me wearing makeup and going by Ethel on the street, not once have I been made to feel unsafe for my gender or sexuality. Not even during the summer months when family members from Afghanistan migrate to Delhi before going back in September, meaning our area becomes a mix of former Afghan refugees and those visiting from Afghanistan. I have never been made to feel unwelcome for who I am as an openly queer person. I also want to be clear that this doesn't mean you cannot criticize Islam as a religion, a fact I say as someone with 102 videos doing just that. A playlist I only made to shut up evangelical Christians who kept accusing me of unfairly targeting their religion whilst ignoring all others during my primarily secularism days. I actually did a count and found out that 1 out of every 5 videos put out was on Islam, with 3 of those being on Christianity and the remaining 1 being a wildcard video. Though something else I noticed when tallying them up, about 80 to 90% of my videos on Islam were responses to Ayera or other London Dawah groups. Dawah is Islam's form of evangelism, and a particularly vile little cretin by the name of Hamza Sortsis kept turning up in my life, first at my college, then my university, leading to a very prolonged back and forth. And whilst I've largely moved on from those days, though I am thinking of doing some videos on evangelical Christianity due to its impact upon the world, if another incident like the No Outsiders protest were to happen, I would absolutely cover it. Criticizing Islam and demonizing multiple groups of people linked to the Middle East are not the same thing. You can absolutely do the former without resorting to rhetoric that does the latter, Yet some people ignore that distinction, like we've seen today. Sadly, I expect we're going to see a lot more of this rhetoric following Israel's assault on Iran, which is why I really needed to get this video done and published. You need to be able to challenge the fascist narrative, because that's what this is, full-blown fascism. That's why Israel has stepped up its violent expansionism, because fascism needs a constant feed of new land and resources in order to uphold this idea of national exceptionalism. Anytime a fascist nation has hit a wall and stopped expanding, it has died. For as silly as Jordan Peterson was in comparing people to lobsters, that's not a bad analogy for fascism. Lobsters are effectively immortal and will continue to grow bigger and bigger as they age, at least, that is, until they reach a point where they can't shed their old shell for a new one and effectively rot to death inside a prison of their own making. This means the sooner we can halt that growth, the sooner the monster dies, the more people will be saved. And the only thing powering Israel's war machine is support from the global north. So now, more than ever, I need you all to keep a sharp mind. Don't believe the propaganda for European imperialism, which blames the Middle East for the horrors we inflicted upon them. I know most of you are better than that. How, for every Nicola Johnson in the audience, there are 1,000 of you who would never dream of doing such a thing. Though, what do you think? What are your thoughts on the comment? Why has this been such an effective lie for Israel in the past? Do you think that's changing, and if so, why? Did you notice something I missed? If so, be sure to let me know in the comments down below. And if you appreciate what we do here and want to help keep us running, please consider becoming one of the wonderful patrons who make our work possible. You can also make a one-time donation via PayPal or Super Thanks on YouTube. On that note, we'd just like to thank the following people: Matthew Kovac, Flynn, Bo Ayer, Deborah Goldsmith, Higgins the Seagull, Jackie Sins, Mix Alba, and Peter Cole. And for myself, Adita and Levi, take care now.